Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first geriatric grand rounds of the year. I think it's right at 7:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. Have a few announcements to begin with. So again, this is our first grand rounds of the year. Our second and next grand rounds will be September 17th, and our presenter will be Dr. Carrie Levy. So please join us for that. Next Journal Club, which is also starting up, that will be next Thursday, September 10th. That will be via Zoom, so look for the link for that. And the presenters will be also Dr. Carrie Levy and Dr. Samantha Farrow. Other announcements, there is a division Zoom meeting following today's presentation, so please look for that invite for geriatrics faculty and join in on that. For today's presentation, if you'd like a copy of that, please send an email to Carlene Stratton at va.gov for that. And after the presentation, you will receive a link to an online evaluation of today's presentation. So if you could take a minute to fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Emmy Betz. Dr. Betz is an emergency physician and researcher here at University of Colorado School of Medicine. She's a research physician within the GREC and is Deputy Director of the Program for Injury Prevention, Education, and Research at the Anschutz Medical Campus. Her research focuses on patient-centered injury prevention. She has active NIH funding for projects on older drivers, firearm suicide prevention, and firearm access in dementia. And today she's going to be sharing with us a presentation about firearms and dementia. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Betz. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you to everybody for joining, especially the many other parents out there who are trying to get kids to online school and such in these strange times. I have left some time for questions at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will hopefully have some discussion at the end. So as Dr. Hildreth said, today I'm going to be talking about dementia and firearms. And I wanted to start by framing the larger work that my lab does, which is really that we're interested in how we as healthcare providers can help facilitate difficult discussions, specifically around injury prevention, the so-called elephant in the room that many of us, whatever the topic, may not want to discuss or know how to discuss. And how can we do it better? How can we help patients make choices to be healthier, to prevent injuries? And so a lot of our work currently focuses on older drivers and questions around how we can help older drivers both be safe, but also really maintain independence. And we published a paper a few years ago summarizing qualitative work from many others, really highlighting what it is that patients want from providers, which is that they wanted acknowledgement that discussions about driving are emotionally charged and difficult. And I've certainly heard this from many of my geriatrician friends that talking about driving might be one of their least favorite subjects. So perhaps both sides, it's uncomfortable. Also that conversations around driving should be context sensitive. So it's a new diagnosis, it's a new condition that's causing the problem. It's not that you are a bad driver. And also that they prefer it with trusted providers and over time, so they have time to prepare, time to think about what they want to do. And so we started thinking, well, gosh, firearms, it's another potential injury issue and also pretty sensitive. And so could communications be similar? And that was one of the sort of first questions that really led us down this pathway of thinking about what do we know about firearm access in dementia? How can we help older adults and caregivers make decisions? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. First, of course, need to start by acknowledging and thanking, especially the National Institutes of Health, for their support of this work. I do also have a VA affiliation, and nothing I'm going to say today, of course, represents the official views of either the NIH or the VA. And then we also have some funding from foundations that I will mention. Perhaps equally important as a disclosure is that I am lucky to work with a very large and multidisciplinary team, both here at CU Anschutz and across the country. And so while I am the lucky one who gets to talk to you today, this work is really a team effort, because science really is a team sport. And so thank you to the many people who have influenced this work over the years and continue to do so. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit about what we know right now about firearm access in dementia. Then I'm going to dive just a little bit into some of the relevant laws and logistical considerations before then turning to what it is that we know that caregivers want and need, and then as clinicians, what it is that we can be doing. So I'll start off with
screen.
Emmy,
yeah, you can't see my screen?
showing, can you share your screen?
Oh my gosh,
No,
so
that's
sorry.
okay.
I thought that I had done that. Jeez, oh my goodness. Hang on. Is it up there now? I'm so sorry.
There it is.
Okay. This is perhaps the most important slide to show, which is really all of the wonderful people I work with. And apologies for the technology issues this morning. So to get back on track, so this is what we'll be talking about today. And I want to start by doing a little bit about what we know around rates and risks, both prevalence of firearms in the US and in homes of people with dementia, as well as the potential risks of firearm-related injury and dementia. I do also, I realize I didn't say, as I usually do, that I think it's really important that we as clinicians in discussing these things recognize our own viewpoints and potential biases. And so I always like to start by just sharing, I'm not a firearm owner myself, but I work closely with firearm owners, firearm organizations, and have been very excited and proud to do so. I have many family members who are responsible hunters or firearm owners for other reasons. And so in this presentation today, I am not trying to talk about gun control, Second Amendment issues. I'm really coming at this from a perspective of how we as clinicians can better work with our patients in a way that is respectful to them and acceptable to them. Okay, so what do we know about guns in dementia? So this is a chart you can see. This is from back in about 2013. Already back then, there were more guns than people in the United States. So even if we were to completely stop sales tomorrow, which we're not going to, there are a lot of guns out there. And I think it's important that we know how to talk to patients about them. Certainly during COVID, there's been another big uptick in gun sales, although there's not evidence that I've seen that it has been in the older adult population per se. Certainly firearm safety is even more important now in the COVID era, but I think what I'm going to present around dementia has probably not changed much. As I already alluded to, there are lots of reasons that people own firearms, often multiple reasons. When we think about, this is from a survey in 2017 asking adults in the United States their reasons for ownership, and people could give more than one reason. And what we see in the United States now is that self-protection or protection of family is listed as the top reason for ownership, followed by hunting or sport shooting. And the reason this is important is because, of course, it affects what people do with their guns at home, how they store them, and what they might be willing to talk about doing when someone becomes impaired. If it's for a once-a-year hunting trip versus their desire for having a gun close for daily protection, those are going to affect what older adults and what caregivers want to think about. So what do we know in the United States about household firearm prevalence? These next statistics are older adults age 65 and older, not necessarily with dementia. It's an estimated 33% own a firearm or more themselves. And then another 12% live with a firearm owner, although they're not an owner themselves. So, 45% living in homes with at least one firearm, and then the remainder not. This certainly varies geographically, which should really surprise any of us. This next chart, this map shows prevalence of a gun stored in or around the home. This is now adults age 55 and older. And this is from a weighted national survey. And what we can see is that in the Mountain West region, where probably most of us are practicing, and in the South, it's estimated that over half of adults age 55 and older live in a home with a firearm, with lower prevalence rates in different parts of the country. Certainly, even within states, it's going to vary if you're practicing in a rural area versus an urban area and so forth. Will also vary certainly in, for example, veteran populations. I know I've, in talking to Jolene Sussman and others who work within VA populations, talking about how basically it seems that every veteran has a firearm. Not to suggest that any of these populations are homogenous. Of course, we need to be talking with our patients as individuals, but certainly understanding the variance in depending on where you're working and the population you're with can be helpful. So what about in dementia? And this is where I will acknowledge it gets a little trickier. It's been wonderful to work in this area because we have a lot of knowledge gaps. This is from a study back in 1999 that found, this was within a memory clinic, so community dwelling, older adults being seen in a memory clinic, up to 60% had a firearm in their home. So it's interesting because that's actually higher than the prevalence estimates for the general adult population. Some work that we and others have done have now suggested this is probably a little bit high when you think about community dwelling adults with dementia. My guess is it's going to be more in that 40 to 50% range, in line with the general adult population. Certainly most memory care memory care residence units, nursing homes don't allow firearms, so those folks are really taken out of these statistics. We're really talking about the community dwelling older adults. But if you multiply this out, if you take the 60% estimates, based on the projected growth in the population with Alzheimer's, there could be up to 12 million people with dementia who live in a home with a firearm by 2050. So certainly this is not a universal issue in that it's every family dealing with this, but it's not an insignificant issue. And I think for those of you on the front lines caring for patients, I'm guessing that many of you have stories about how and when this has come up. So next I wanted to present a little bit of work that we just published this summer. This was from NIH supported work. This was a nationally representative weighted survey of adults living in homes with guns. So we only surveyed people who live in homes with a gun as an owner or a non-owner. And then we further restricted the population to look at caregivers, so people who said that they were informal caregivers of a person with dementia. And we asked them some questions about firearm access in the home. And you can see in this chart, I've divided it, the columns are whether they lived with the person that they were caring for or did not live with them. And a couple of things I want to highlight here. So first is that for the people who lived with the person with dementia, and again, these are homes where 100% of the homes had a firearm in them. 31% said that the person with dementia could still access that gun. So I think certainly this is another thing to think about, even when it's not necessarily the gun belonging to the person with dementia. Who else in the home might have some, and how are they storing them? And then when asked, does the person with dementia themselves own a firearm, you can see here among people who live together, it was estimated at 29% versus only 9% if they did not live with the person. That difference is interesting. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it. I would hypothesize, though, that 9% might be artificially low, and then it may be that in some cases caregivers are not sure. That was an option that they could say not sure, but I bet that there are some cases where a caregiver thinks mom or dad doesn't own a firearm, but in fact they do. So it's hard to know what that true prevalence actually is. But in any case, I think this adds further evidence that yes, in many of these community dwelling adults with dementia, they probably do have firearm access in many of their homes. So why do we worry about this? What are the risks of injury when you think about firearms in the context of dementia? We published a paper last year looking at violence overall in older adults. And I wanted to show this just to remind us all the overall injury patterns in older adults. So these two charts are showing now homicides and suicides, and you can see the y-axis is age in years going up. The bottom, the x-axis is age-adjusted death rates. So what clearly stands out is that the bulk is in suicide across the age span, but especially in the older adult age groups. The vast majority of violent deaths, including deaths by firearm, are suicides, not homicides. And so, in fact, when you look at statistics, all firearm deaths in older adults, 91% of them are suicides. Firearms are also the most common method of suicide among people with dementia, estimated at about 73% of suicides in people with a diagnosis of dementia are by firearm versus about 50% in all ages, and in people without dementia. So I'll come back to this later, but I think certainly this risk of suicide is one that caregivers may not think about as much, but it's really important that we help educate them, especially because dementia itself may be a risk factor for suicide, especially early in the disease or shortly after diagnosis. And so being attuned to that, I think, is also important. I think this is the homicide piece, or the violence piece, violence towards others, is what we might first think about. And we certainly know that dementia can bring hallucinations, delusions, agitation, aggression, paranoia, not recognizing people. And so there are many anecdotes around, a person not recognizing their spouse in the middle of the night, around thinking that, say, a home PT, a physical therapist who's coming over, is actually an intruder, and so forth. And so we absolutely worry about those, the potential for violence in those settings, because if a gun is available, the likelihood of a fatal or near fatal injury is higher than if the gun is not present. I think in the context of dementia, there's certainly overlap with unintentional injuries, because you could argue that someone with dementia who harms another person in a context of confusion may not have truly intended to do that. But when unintentional injuries, we also need to think about even just things like weapons handling, cleaning a gun. Someone who may have been a very responsible owner their whole life, police officer and so forth, may no longer have the cognitive ability to tell if a weapon is loaded. They may forget that they just loaded it, et cetera, et cetera. And so the safe handling skills become impaired, as does the judgment of when to shoot or not. PBS did a really, I thought, lovely story about 2 years ago now, and that includes some interviews with caregivers and people with dementia who have faced these issues. And they give one example of a woman who, her husband was a retired sheriff. She had already locked up all the guns in the house in the safe, but she said he would really ask to see them every day, that they had always been a part of his life. And so he often wanted to clean them, touch them, hold them, et cetera, check on them. And she said he seemed like he was doing better. And so one day she let him get the guns out. She got one out for him. She checked it and thought it was not loaded. Of course, you know where the story is going. In fact, it was loaded. And he shot her in the stomach by accident. Even while she was on the phone with 911, he was not aware of what was going on or why 911 was coming. And she survived. She said to this day, he doesn't know what happened or that he shot her. And she expresses some gratitude for that, in the sense that he would have been devastated by it. But I think it really highlights how these kinds of cases where someone who is very capable and responsible in a previous physical condition now has developed a condition that really impairs his ability. This question may come up later. So no, we don't have any great estimates of how often this happens or how often there's a threatening incident, a near shooting, and so forth, because those kinds of statistics just aren't really collected. And so I can't tell you beyond, there are lots of anecdotes that yes, it happens. but it's hard to know. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit now to talk some about some of the legal issues and logistical issues that caregivers face. And I will preface this by saying in many places it's pretty murky still, and so I can't give you hard and fast rules on everything. There is one thing that is very clear, which is that we as healthcare providers are allowed to talk to our patients about firearm safety. There are no current laws prohibiting that. Absolutely, we need to be doing it in a way that is respectful and not offensive and not politically motivated. But there's nothing preventing us from doing this. And so I think it's important that we do it when it's appropriate. So, state laws related to dementia. I am not a policy expert. I don't think physicians need to be policy experts, but I think it's useful to know what's out there, at least basics. And in this case, there's not much. So only Hawaii and Texas have specific state laws related to firearm ownership or possession in the context of dementia. And basically in Hawaii, it's that possession is prohibited if there's an organic brain syndrome. Doesn't really clarify what that is or severity. It's not clear how the law is applied, whether firearms are ever confiscated, etc. And then interestingly in Texas, people with so-called chronic dementia, again, not really clarified what constitutes chronic versus acute dementia, are ineligible for a license to carry a handgun, but they may still actually purchase or possess them. And then in all the other states, there are no state laws that are relevant to either ownership or purchase of firearms in the context of for someone, by someone with dementia. That's where potentially federal background checks may come into play. So this is the federal background check form. States then determine when and how exactly it's used, but this is the form that has to be, the background check that has to be completed generally when a new firearm is purchased. And it has a bunch of questions about whether someone would be prohibited from possessing a firearm. And the only thing relevant to dementia here is this question that, have you ever been adjudicated as a mental defective? Just horrifically offensive language, that's for another day. But importantly, this is in most states, this is a court judgment. So this is not simply a physician's diagnosis, et cetera, would not put someone into this category of not being able to purchase. So for example, if you go to a gun store, it's not like they have access to any medical records to know who has particular cognitive diseases or not. So the summary is that really there's not any current state or federal laws really on a broad scale that would keep a person with dementia from buying a new firearm. And there's certainly no program in place where firearms would be confiscated from someone with dementia or a diagnosis of dementia. Some states do have licensing laws. For those in the audience who are not as familiar with firearms, I'll just say there's not a system like registration, like car registration. So there's not, this is what complicates it as well. There's not a system of knowing who does or doesn't have firearms currently. Some states do have licensing laws, but again, they often apply when you're acquiring a new firearm as opposed to kind of annual licensing or annual safety checks. And so I think all of this really leaves then caregivers and potentially providers as the ones who are having to make decisions about what to do. I will just mention extreme risk protection orders have been identified as one mechanism that caregivers might use. These are the so-called red flag laws that allow family or law enforcement to temporarily and then potentially permanently confiscate weapons from someone who is at imminent harm of hurting themselves or others. And there's a court process that people go through. Colorado does have a red flag law now as of January that again, family can petition. I think in some cases, this might be a useful option for caregivers if they really feel like they don't have anything else they can do. But I think, I suspect that in most cases, it's a kind of last resort, that more often people are going to be looking at things they can do on their own without involving law enforcement, without involving kind of other legal processes. So I think it's useful to know, this is kind of in your back pocket, if someone really runs into a situation where they feel like they can't do something voluntarily, or the person with dementia is very agitated or aggressive and they're really having issues. But otherwise, this is not what I would suggest as the first line. So what is it that caregivers think about then? When we're talking about firearm access and dementia, there really then become two main choices for caregivers. So one is more secure storage at home, so making sure that the person with dementia can't access the firearms. And then the second, which we'll talk about, is getting guns out of the home. When it comes to at-home storage, there are lots of storage devices. I wanted to give a shout out to Alzheimer's San Diego, which is a local organization that has taken on the sort of firearm and dementia piece and has a really cool partnership with a local firearm range, doing cross-training, training the range providers about dementia and what it is, and then also training the Alzheimer's service providers about some firearm basics. And they have a video out that's about some of the storage basics. There are lots and lots of storage devices that caregivers and family members can look at, and you can buy these online, you can buy them at stores. The key point, of course, for all of these is that the person with dementia should not be able to open them. So they shouldn't know the passcode or the PIN, they shouldn't have the key, etc. If it's a safe that's been at home for a long time, most safes you can change the combination or the passcode so that the person can no longer access them. Another thing we do talk about in the context of dementia is disassembly. This is obviously full disassembly, but there are things you can do to disable a gun. For example, taking out a firing pin that makes the gun look still functional, but it's not. And so this would be in the kind of, maybe in the therapeutic lying kind of category of how to work with someone with dementia. So it may reduce their anxiety if they can still touch it and hold it and handle it, but it's no longer dangerous. The caveat, of course, is that if for some reason police were called to the home, someone else comes to the home, it also looks like a functional weapon to anyone else. And so it potentially could raise the risk of sort of a violent confrontation in that case. But it is an option that caregivers can think about. If a caregiver is not familiar with firearm handling, they should not try to mess with it themselves. That's something that they could call law enforcement or a range or a retailer or a trusted friend to help them with. So we also though think about out-of-home firearm storage. So caregivers may want to lock some things up at home. They may want to get all of them out of the house or some of them out of the house. Sometimes those moves can be temporary, so especially for suicide risk, or if a family is deciding what they want to do long-term. And for dementia, typically those transfers are going to be more of a permanent solution because the dementia is not going to resolve. Options include family members, certainly temporary storage at gun shops, retailers, ranges, some pawn shops. And a couple of things to note here. So law enforcement and firearm retailers or ranges are not required to provide storage. Law enforcement must provide storage of guns in cases like domestic violence restraining orders, but not for sort of private reasons. And so a few years ago, I was able to work with Carol Runyon on a project she led surveying law enforcement agencies and gun ranges and retailers in the Mountain West region to ask, do you currently provide storage? If we're telling people this is an option, is it actually an option? And what she found was that about 3/4 of law enforcement agencies said that they would provide storage, but only about half of ranges and retailers. And some of the challenges that they cited were liability while actually storing. So do they have the space? Is it secure? Is it temperature controlled, etc.? But also especially this piece around liability upon returning the gun. So how do they know if someone's suicide risk has passed? What happens if the person comes and gets their gun back and then kills themselves or someone else? Are they liable? So I think the take home in the context of dementia is certainly to always call ahead to local places to ask. Don't just show up at a retailer or certainly law enforcement with a trunk full of guns without asking if they store them or would sell them. On the legal piece around either selling or storing, a big question that comes up for caregivers is, it's not my gun, am I allowed to do this? This is where it's also, I would say, a little bit murky. There's not, we've had discussions with the ATF and other, and retailers and other groups who are deeply involved in this. And so a power of attorney generally would cover ownership of things like firearms. So if a caregiver has a legal power of attorney, likely they're fully covered. But interestingly, there's not, because guns don't generally have like a proof of ownership, a title like a car would. If a person took a, let's say I took, my parents' guns in to either store or sell, really the recourse would be if the parent, if the person with dementia, either called the police to cite the gun as stolen or otherwise sort of filed a complaint. So some retailers will have a waiting period where they wait, at least 4 to 8 hours before selling a gun to make sure that it's not stolen. But otherwise, many places are probably very likely to do it. And it doesn't mean that the person with dementia needs to go to the store with the caregiver. So I realize this is all might feel a little sketchy in some ways. Are you taking somebody else's property and doing something with it? And I think it would be helpful if we had additional clarity and support for caregivers in when and how they can do this, as well as then clarity for the retailers, the law enforcement agencies who might be helping with this. From a sales point of view, many retailers will sell firearms. So if you have a firearm that you're interested in selling, they can often serve as a broker. And then for families who just want to get rid of guns, many law enforcement agencies will accept them and then ultimately destroy them. Okay, so moving on to the caregivers. So what is it that we know that they experience, that they need? I've touched on a lot of these, but I wanted to give it a little bit of dedicated time as well. So this is, I'm going back now to this paper that we published in July using some data from a nationally weighted survey. So again, same setup. These are the columns where these are caregivers who themselves live in homes with guns and either live with or don't live with the person with dementia. And overall, 11% said they had at some point had concerns about the person with dementia having firearm access. So it may be that in some of these cases, the person with dementia never had access, or it may be that they have, it was already taken care of, et cetera, or they don't live together and so the person had never had access at their home. Interestingly though, among the 11% who had concerns, only half said that they had done something. And I think this, to me, highlights a gap that I would hope that, that concerns would at least prompt getting information, conversations, et cetera. And so it may be that how people interpreted this question, but I think often caregivers can feel a bit paralyzed and not knowing what to do. So then we also asked, okay, so what about planning ahead? Does the person with dementia have some kind of plan for what they want to happen when they become unsafe to handle them? And what we found was really only about half of the caregivers said yes, the person with dementia has written it down or otherwise made a plan of who they trust to take the weapons, who they want to give them to, et cetera. And then I think this highlights another area where we ideally would be engaging with people in earlier stages of dementia to make their own decisions. So then we asked these caregivers, so should healthcare providers talk about firearm safety with caregivers? And the overwhelming majority said yes, always or sometimes. And again, this comes back, I think, to the sort of context. But even though the vast majority said yes, absolutely, caregivers should be talking about firearms, or clinicians should be talking about firearm safety, only 5% of these caregivers said that any healthcare provider had ever spoken to them about firearm safety. And so I think, again, this highlights some great opportunities for us to develop better policies, programs, resources, talking points, et cetera, for clinicians. and it's not just about clinicians, which I'll get to in a moment. And I certainly feel the pain of the many things clinicians are tasked with doing. But I do think this is an area where we could probably do more. So then we asked the caregivers, what are you worried about? In the sense of what do you think is most likely to happen? And you may remember back in the beginning of the talk, I presented briefly some of the relative risks of injuries, the types of injuries we think about. And so that's what we asked people to rank. We said which of these was most likely and which was least likely. So accidentally harming themselves or someone else, harming themselves on purpose, so suicide, or harming somebody else on purpose. And here's what we found. So most caregivers said the accidental harm was most likely. Remember, we know that suicide is actually most common. And so I think that there's also an educational gap here, maybe a disconnect, that we, I think, can do a better job with our patients and with the public about talking about suicide risk in older adults. And certainly this leads into the larger conversation around autonomy at the end of life, physician-assisted suicide, palliative care, et cetera, and thinking about how we support older adults and their families. And I would argue that firearm suicide can be a pretty horrible way for a family to lose a loved one, in terms of not being able to say goodbye, and certainly also the sort of physical nature of it. And so, you know, is there a gap here that we are not helping people have more compassionate options perhaps at the end of life too? So that's also a topic for another day, but I think it's a really important one that we address, that how do we really think about people's concerns and preferences, et cetera, at the end of life. So I know I've been talking a lot about what clinicians can do, but I think it's not just clinicians who have a role in this. We also asked these caregivers, and remember, these were all caregivers who themselves lived in homes with guns. We asked them, where do you get information, or would you get information? And they could answer multiple choices, so friends or family, national or local dementia groups, healthcare providers, and then national or local firearm groups. And there were, I think, some somewhat interesting trends. So the leading kind of, I would use this category, were friends and family, which doesn't surprise me at all. I think that especially on these kind of more sensitive topics, people often turn to the people they trust. Certainly national and local dementia groups, though, there were very high proportions there, and healthcare providers about half. Somewhat lower numbers for firearm organizations, but I think that's actually still really notable that 40% said that they would look to national firearm organizations for information. And yes, there were also many who said they wouldn't use that. But what this figure shows me is that we need a multi-pronged approach. I think there are some caregivers and some older adults who are going to look to Alzheimer's associations, other aging service providers, or their doctors. And there are others who are going to want to go to their local gun shop and have information from sort of trusted firearm organizations. And so ideally we would have partnerships or independent but parallel messaging to get information out so that people can find it wherever it is that they look for it. And this is an example of some of the things that are out there. So Alzheimer's San Diego, I know I gave a shout out to already. They've developed some sort of rack cards that can be used at gun shops. And so in the Colorado Firearm Safety Coalition, which I lead here in Colorado, some of the shops we work with ask for similar materials. So we've created a kind of rack card that shops could have if they wanted to help educate customers about what dementia is. The National Shooting Sports Foundation and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention have a wonderful joint program that's for suicide prevention, but I think is a really lovely model of how organizations can work together to get messaging out to the communities who need it. And then on the right side of the screen, the agreement about firearms is something that we published a few years ago as an idea of kind of an advanced directive conversation starter to get people to think about what they would want to do with their firearms themselves later in life. And it's available in the Annals of Internal Medicine publication. I'm happy to send it to you as well. If you want to email me, I can send you a copy of it. And so this work then has led to, again, with NIH support, has led to develop our team to develop Safety and Dementia, which is a website that is out there and available. We are still making some tweaks to it, but you are welcome to use it, to refer people to it, to tell us what's terrible about it or what you like about it. It's based on the model of a decision aid, so working with Dan Matlock and his deep experience in this field, of thinking about how we help caregivers work through these decisions in a stepwise manner. It also includes driving and general home safety, both because these are important injury topics, but also because, again, it provides that context and it makes this something that's usable for everyone. So it's available at safetyanddementia.org if you are interested, and it's also at that QR code. Okay, so I want to finish up and then take some questions, but I want to talk a little bit about at least one framework for clinicians in thinking about when and how to talk to patients and caregivers about this. So shout out to Jolene Sussman at the VA, who is the one who I think first I heard use this phrase. I might be paraphrasing her, so apologies, Jolene, if you're on. But basically the concept that it's the disease, it's not the person, and really emphasizing to family, you know, your dad may have always been safe, but now this disease has made it that he should no longer be doing this. And I think in that sense, again, it's like these sort of designated driver, friends don't let friends drive drunk. When someone is impaired, we keep them safe. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. It doesn't mean they're trying to hurt people, but we look out for them as a community to make sure that they can't cause harm to themselves or to others. And so what's out there right now? So the Alzheimer's Association does have a checklist that includes a lot of safety topics. And then the question, do you have firearms in your home? So that's one way you could think about phrasing it. Although then the follow-up question should really be, how are they stored? How are they locked? And then the VA does recommend that firearms be included in the safety assessment that's part of the dementia diagnosis visit, and includes driving, power tools, kitchen safety, etc., some other injury topics. Could templates help? I think most of us know that often when electronic medical record makes it easier to do something, we're more likely to do it. And so this was a study back from 2008 comparing a geriatric clinic and a memory clinic. The memory clinic had a template, and lo and behold, they were much better about documenting conversations about firearms. So I think this is where, again, it can't just be provider education. It's got to be thinking about how do we make our systems better? How do we make it easy to fit these kinds of conversations into visits? Because what do patients want? Well, I showed you some of the data before about caregivers saying, yes, it's okay to talk about this. In another large study, patients said, yes, it's okay to talk about firearms when it is relevant to the clinical condition. And I think patients and caregivers want patient-centered care. They want counseling that's individualized, but also routine. So we always bring this up. Let's talk about your situation. They want us to advise them, but not be lecturing, and then at least be knowledgeable enough that we're not totally an idiot. And so I started at the beginning, and I know you all couldn't see the slide, but now you can see it. So what we had found from driving, does this relate to firearms? And I think it probably does. When we talk about firearms, it is emotional. It's, for many people, might be a part of their, always have been a part of their identity. We want to blame it on the disease or the specific deficits that are causing problems. It's probably best when it's a provider who's trusted and when it's over time, so that ideally older adults with early cognitive impairment can make their own decisions. And so one sort of framework that's out there was proposed by Patel et al. And uses the clinical dementia rating but you could certainly use other things, thinking about degree of impairment and then the kinds of questions and actions that you should take. So, thinking about the transition from mild cognitive impairment when people are still pretty intact to mild dementia when Importantly, they may lack insight to those deficits, and they may have some behavioral symptoms developing. And then certainly more moderate or severe dementia, which I think in those cases, it typically is more obvious that someone should not have access to firearms or cars anymore. And so in the mild cognitive impairment realm, the kinds of questions would be things like firearms at home, and are they accessible? Have there been changes in personality and judgment, hostility, aggression, and so forth? Any symptoms of depression or talking about death, concerns for suicide? And then the next steps would be potentially testing or referral for formal diagnosis and potential treatment of the etiology of the cognitive impairment. Patel et al. Suggested the sort of assessment or training by firearm specialists. I think this is a fascinating idea, but there's no evidence to support it. And again, you know, a spot training session or taking dad to the range can show how he's functioning on that day, and does he still remember, you know, how to load a weapon, but it doesn't mean that his judgment is intact at 2 in the morning. And so that's where this sort of refresher course has not really, there's not evidence yet that that actually could be helpful in the context of dementia. But then certainly thinking ahead, planning for future changes. Mild dementia, the questioning would be the same. But then in this case, I think it's really more about then educating, counseling the patient and the family about maybe having supervised access to firearms at home, maybe going hunting together, that kind of thing, but otherwise probably not unrestricted access. And then Patel has in here the sort of consider informing authorities or at-risk individuals. I would say that only comes into play when there's a specific threat to a specific named individual, or if the caregivers are kind of at their wits' end, that they feel like they can't do anything, that dad won't let them take the guns and they don't know what to do, and they're really worried about safety. That's where you might think about kind of more legal intervention. Moderate to severe dementia, it shouldn't really matter what the other symptoms are. It's just, are there firearms at home? And they really should not have access. Certainly there's, you know, you want to think about questions around imminent threats to family, especially if there's kind of escalation of behavioral issues. And then making sure that the person doesn't have any firearm access. So just to recap, and then I'm hoping there'll be some opportunity for some discussion, question and answers. So we know that firearms are prevalent in the United States. I think we can estimate that maybe 40% of people with dementia who are community dwelling live in a home with at least one firearm, whether or not they have access to it. There are a lot of murky areas in the law right now, and that complicate both the legal and logistic kind of considerations for caregivers, and I hope that some of those can be clarified in the coming years. I think the take home for us today might be, though, that for in-home storage, there are many, many different kinds of storage options. And then there are also community options for either storage or for selling weapons. Typically, the best thing to do is to call ahead to either law enforcement or retailers nearby. The caregivers, I think we have seen from some of the work we've done and others have done, that there are gaps in education around suicide awareness, around what they can do, where they go to get resources. And so I think we need a broad approach, reaching them through clinical settings, but also through different kinds of community resources. And then for clinicians, I think we can take the time, hopefully through events like today, to get a little more comfortable with these conversations and remember that this is about the disease and not the person. It's not about politics, it's not about gun control, it's about wanting people to be safe at home. And so with that, I will say just thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Apologies for the technology glitch at the beginning, or the memory glitch, I should say. I'm very grateful to the NIH for their support and to the many team members who work with me on this. And I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. That was a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. A couple of questions. So first of all, what have you found to be more challenging, taking keys or guns away from adults with dementia?
Oh, well, so I do think that driving for many people has a more immediate impact on daily life, right? The ability to get to your appointments, to go to your religious services, before COVID, at least, when we all used to go out. So I think in that sense, the practicalities around what it means for your daily life are probably bigger for driving. At the same time, I think for firearms, obviously it is a very sensitive topic. And I think, especially if there's a mismatch between caregivers and the older adult in terms of their familiarity and comfort with firearms, that can be more difficult. But I'm going to say, I'm actually going to put my money maybe on driving, because I think that it's something that you have to replace. I mean, right? Like there has to be another transportation option for the person.
Another question, if you could discuss the conundrum posed by the higher risk of delirium in the face of any level of stable cognitive impairment. This combination may pose a sudden, unexpected change that could be acutely dangerous.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think it's just, again, about highlighting to caregivers, as well as potentially to older adults, to understand that it's the disease and it's their brain is not functioning the way it used to. And so the things that they have been good at their whole life may no longer be safe. And so, you know, especially the 2 in the morning confusion and mistaking your wife of 50 years for an intruder. I have heard, and again, this is where the frontline stories from people like Jolene Sussman are so helpful. And also thinking about how you approach this, that for some people, it's the fear of hurting someone is really going to resonate. For others, it might be playing up the safety responsibility piece. You've always looked out for your family. The safest thing to do now is X, Y, Z, and so forth. And so the sort of like spinning your counseling a bit, depending on what seems to resonate for the person. But I think it's a good point to bring up that yes, even in dementia, you get sort of fluctuations, and that delirium can make it much worse.
Thank you. Another question, what are some tips and tricks for working with the caregiver or patient who is extremely resistant or hostile to even having a talk about safer storage or removal of firearms?
Yeah, well, I think that's where, you know, we as healthcare providers, I believe, have a responsibility to do what we can to educate and bring topics up, and then recognize sometimes we're not the ones who are going to find a solution or help find a solution. And so that's where I would hope pointing people to other resources that may be more acceptable to them. Certainly on our side, we need to do what we can to document those conversations and so forth. And you know, if you get into a situation where you really are worried that there's elder abuse or neglect or things like that, that's a different kind of case. But I think not every caregiver is going to connect with us, and that, like, we need to be okay with that too. And that's where I think having community education, community resources is so important. Oh, and then Jolene just put a comment in too about sort of motivational interviewing techniques. That's a great point. Can be really helpful.
All right, any other questions? Okay. Again, thank you so much. Any final?
I would just want to say thank you, and I will put my email in the chat box. I'm always happy to have people contact me for questions, comments, resources, and so forth. But thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for attending.